Looks like it's working. And the meeting is being recorded. Got it. So today, this is a follow-up to the introduction to artificial intelligence that I did a few weeks ago. And if you didn't see that, the recording is available. This one follows up by talking about AI policies, guidelines, and frameworks. So we're not talking so much about how AI works in this session. We're talking about the approaches that different governments, organizations, etc., have taken with regard to policies, guidelines, and frameworks. So the workshop, as the slide says, we'll look at recent policies, guidelines, and frameworks. I can't do them all. There's more than 100 of them. There's perhaps even more. But I do want to talk about some of the elements these policies and frameworks have in common and how people go about creating them, sorts of things that they address. I also want to give all of you the opportunity to engage with the topic by thinking about the important values and principles that govern your own thinking and your own approach to the ethics of artificial intelligence. So I have a fun activity planned, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Won't be long. I do want to look at the question just to frame our discussion. And the question, if you had to boil it down, is something like this. Artificial intelligence is a new type of technology. It's fundamentally new in many ways. It offers capacities that we haven't seen before in any of our technologies. But with that, it offers, or perhaps presents, risks that are unlike any of those we've seen before. I mean, there was even a well-known statement recently about the possibility of artificial intelligence taking over the world and exterminating humanity. I'm pretty sure that won't happen. In fact, I would bet money on it. But there are risks. There are real risks. And these range from bias and prejudice to automated decision-making without appeal, to our loss of privacy, to AI bringing us to a culture of blandness and retreat to the middle ground, and more. There's so much more. So governments, industry, societies, organizations, and pretty much everybody has been grappling with this question. How do we govern ourselves with regard to the creation and use of artificial intelligence technology? So it's not a simple question, and it doesn't have a simple answer. And there are different parts to the question, especially when we look at the different codes and frameworks that have been developed. A lot of the time you'll see them presented maybe in the media as just this list of principles or this list of conditions, but these statements are generally organized of different parts. And this is one framework here that we see on the screen. It's not the only framework that exists. And I use this one because it has a number of different components that are used by many, but not necessarily all of the statements of principles and ethics. Off to the left-hand side, there is, under the heading of knowledge, what we know about AI, what we believe about it, what our experiences have been, what we expect to happen when we use AI. It calls this created reality. We might call this perhaps our worldview or our perspective or our understanding. And I think this is going to be different from person to person, and certainly from society to society. These inform what might be called underlying principles. And we'll look at some of those and even assess some of those in this presentation. These are influenced or informed by fundamental values. And again, we'll look at some of those. The principles talk about or inform codes of conduct, which may relate to ethics, may relate to morals, may relate to laws. And ultimately, the objective is to give us a guide and maybe a motivation to behave in certain ways. Now, if you don't like this framework, that's fine. There's no law that says you have to follow this framework. And that's one of the interesting things about AI, right? There isn't agreement even on the fundamentals of how we talk about the principles of AI. This isn't a session about ethics, and I don't want to delve into the theories and principles of ethics generally to any great detail. But I think it's useful at this juncture just to quickly characterize some major approaches to ethics. Again, we think of ethics a lot of the time as codes of conduct or rules for the governing of behavior. But again, how we think about ethics, what our moral principles are, vary from person to person because we come from different perspectives or backgrounds. So I've listed 4 major approaches to ethics. These characterize 4 major philosophical schools that have developed over the last 2,500 years. Again, this list isn't definitive, it's a guide only. One of the major schools of ethics is based on virtue and character. It has its origins in the Greek writings of Aristotle. It's characterized by the principle, be all that you can be. The idea is that ethical behavior results from being an ethical person. And an ethical person is described as, well, no, here we get into the details, right? Honest, virtuous, sharing, compassionate, curious, willing to learn. There's a whole list of traits that might characterize an ethical person. Or there might be one essential trait that is over and above all other traits, right? Maybe honesty, right? An honest person is an ethical person, and all the other behaviors follow from that. That's one approach. Another approach, based in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, is duty. And Kant says 2 things. He says, first of all, our ethical principles should be such that if I have a principle, then everybody else in the world should be able to have that principle and things would still be okay. So if one of my principles is take whatever you want, obviously that wouldn't work if everybody in the world did that. So maybe something like take what you need might be better. Or maybe something like take your fair share might be even better because everybody could do that. So that's one aspect of duty, is this universality of the principle. The second is, Kant says, people should be treated as means, not ends. You shouldn't use people. Rather, your ethics should recognize the inherent worth or value of an individual person. So out of that, we get a set of obligations or responsibilities or duties that tell us how we ought to conduct ourselves in the world. Another major school is consequentialism. This is based in the writings of people like Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill. And basically, it's the principle that the ends justify the means. If you produce a good outcome, that's what your ethical theory should guide you toward. What is a good outcome? Well, Mill says it's happiness, the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. But what counts as pleasure? Is it just purely, pleasure in the moment, like a hedonist might like? Or is it, as John Stuart Mill says, one of the higher pleasures, love of knowledge? Finally, we have social contract. And I lumped together a bunch of theories under this. The most famous is by John Rawls in a book called A Theory of Justice, just from the 1970s. Although social contract theory has a history that goes back all the way to people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. And the idea is that ethics are created by agreement, that we get together, either actually or theoretically, and decide for ourselves what's right and what's wrong. This social contract might be a religious contract where we all agree to adhere to a particular set of values as stated in our religion, or it can be a cultural contract or a governmental contract like a Bill of Rights or a constitution. There are various ways of framing that. So as you can see, there are different approaches to ethics, different ways we could characterize our approach to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Okay, let's have some fun. What are your values when it comes to artificial intelligence? So if you scan the QR code on your phone, or better, follow this link on your computer, the link will show up better. That'll take you to a screen. And in fact, I'll click on this link so we can see it here. That'll take you to a ballot. And there's actually 3 elections. Just do the first one for now. And as you see, on the left-hand side are fairly common ethical principles that relate to artificial intelligence: respect, common cause, fairness, etc. They're randomized, so the order will be different for you. And then across the top, you can rank them: first choice, second choice, etc. So like this, right? So you just fill in your rankings, and then when you're done that, it'll show you what your rankings are. And then you can do as many or as few as you like, and then vote and go to the next election. Just click on this button here. So it'll take a little time for you to do that. So I'm not going to look at the answers right away, but I do hope you participate in that. Otherwise, this won't work, right? So I do hope you participate in that. And we'll come back to the answers that you've provided later on. I predict, I think I'm pretty safe in predicting, different people will put in different answers. And I say that because there's this presumption out there in the world, and we'll look at actually one article or one statement that actually says this explicitly, that everybody agrees on the same set of principles in ethics. And I don't think that's true. And I think there's good evidence to show that that's not true. And this quiz is an example of that sort of evidence, or will be if you all fill it out. If you don't fill it out, well, okay. Get rid of that. So I said this talk, this seminar would be about ethical codes and ethical principles. It's based in work that I've done surveying ethical codes. I've got an ethical codes reader available online at the link you see here. And I will say these slides, you can find these online. Where it says the URL at the bottom here, presentation 575. Or if you scan this QR code in your phone, you can find the slides there as well. They're not up yet, but this will take you to the presentation page where they will be available after the session. And the reason why I'm doing it that way is I'll be adding to these slides the results of your participation in our survey. So be sure to fill the form. So anyhow, I surveyed more than 7, and there's even more now because these statements keep coming out. Different ethical codes of conduct for the different professions. I'm just going to correct the typo there. There we go, that's better. Dealing in different professions dealing with knowledge and technology. So I didn't just look at artificial intelligence codes of conduct, but also things like journalism, medical codes of conduct, social welfare codes of conduct, public service codes of conduct, librarian codes of conduct, and more. And the ethical codes reader provides a brief summary of each code, links to the code webpage, and extracts text from the code. I'll be talking about some of these codes, not all of them, in more detail as we go along. Here's one. Came out in 2017. It's the United Kingdom House of Lords Select Committee on Artificial Intelligence. And this one's important because it was one of the first major statements to come out of a governmental body. And when you look at it, you see that it takes a consequentialist approach. It says it's better to focus on the consequences of artificial intelligence rather than on the way it works, in such a way that people are able to exercise their rights. And of course, the principles that they state, and you can read them in the document, emphasize consequentialist results. You know, the promotion of the good or beneficence, right? Not causing harm, not violating the rights of individuals, things like that. That's a common theme that I've seen in a lot of these statements of ethics. Governments especially, but also other organizations, are very risk averse, meaning that their approach to the governance of AI is based on minimizing risk. And that is a consequentialist approach, right? So they would rather not use AI rather than expose ourselves to too great a risk. And it's also based on, if you will, a sense of balance between the benefits on the one hand and the risks on the other. And this balance approach is very common in these ethical statements. I personally am not in favor of a balanced approach. I prefer in my own ethics to unambiguously pursue the good. But balance, when we're thinking about a social context, is often very important because, as I said earlier, we have different perspectives and different points of view. Could be argued that in some cases you can't achieve a balance. That some things in the case of ethics, and especially in the case of artificial intelligence, are black and white and not shades of gray. Like AI decision making. You either allow that AI would make public policy decisions or you might not. There isn't some sort of middle ground for that. Could be argued. Another major statement, this one came out from the White House a few years ago, well, 3 years ago now, which was basically a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And it's based on these 5 principles: safe and effective systems, protection from algorithmic discrimination. So what that means is that your algorithm should not treat different groups differently, and that the data used to train an algorithm, and we talked about that in the introduction to AI session, should fairly and completely represent all parts of the population. It's a criticism of the approach taken by so many studies in psychology, where a professor will write a paper based on a survey of 42 students in a psychology class in a Midwestern US college. And of course, that's not a representative sample at all. And so the results are very suspect. Well, AI can do the same thing. For example, if we used as a training set for AI all the data from Twitter, well, this data will probably contain elements of prejudice and discrimination, at least if my experience of Twitter is any guide. And that's something that we want to prevent in the development of AI. Now, that's a very common statement. I see that expressed a lot. Data privacy is another one of the major elements of the blueprint. Notice and explanation. It's interesting that these are combined. Notice is, we see this a lot as well. It's a principle of transparency, letting people know that an AI was used. And indeed, in my newsletter, I just ran a link to an article that contained a warning at the top. Some parts of this article were written by an AI and then edited by the author. And I can sort of see that, but I asked in my post, how long it will be before we stop putting these warnings in, because it just becomes so commonplace that we're always using AI to help us write or help us make decisions, etc. How common will this become? How necessary will these notices be? Explanation is interesting because, first of all, it's notoriously difficult. An AI will take into account tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different factors. And there's no single set of factors that you can say, oh, this is the reason why it made that decision. But a lot of these sets of principles ask for some kind of explanation. So how do you provide that? You can't say it followed a rule because it did not follow a rule. A common approach is to try to do it counterfactually. That is to say, you run the same scenario with the artificial intelligence, but you change some factors and see if you get a different result. And that allows you to say, if you had done this, you didn't, but if you had, then this would have been the result. And that's important if the AI, for example, decides that you do not qualify for a loan. An explanation might say, if you owned a house, then you would qualify. But these explanations might not be very useful, because it's not a question of whether or not you owned a house. That wasn't the deciding factor. A lot of people who don't own a house still qualify for a loan. So what was it in your particular case? And that's a real challenge. Finally, the White House statement talks about human alternatives, consideration, and fallback. They call that human in the loop, right? To make sure that there's human oversight, to make sure that the AI is not doing something wrong. Now, we get to the study that I talked about that argues that there's a consensus around artificial intelligence. And it's authored by Jessica Feld and her colleagues from the Harvard Berkman School. And their assertion is that you look at a bunch of different sets of principles of AI, like I did, you get these things in common: privacy, accountability, safety and security, transparency and explainability, fairness and non-discrimination, human control of technology, professional responsibility, and promotion of human values. Now, you get them in common, but as we see from the diagram, and I know it's not a very good diagram, but there's a nice big version in the report, you don't get them in the same quantity. Different studies emphasize different principles differently, and you don't get consensus in the detail. What, for example, is fairness? Is fairness everybody gets the same thing? Or is fairness everybody gets what they need? Or is fairness taking into account historical discrimination and making that right? Different people have different perspectives on fairness, and I would say people at the Harvard Berkman School have one idea of fairness, and people living in rural Canada have a very different view of fairness. That would be my contention. So let's look at your results. Let's see now. I have to get the right screen up here. All right. So here's what we got. No, I'm not sure how many of you participated. It looks like one. But raw ballot table. All right. So here's what was put at the top of our ballot: hair, non-maleficence, in other words, the principle of no harm, democracy, and justice. Now, all of you sitting there. Now, I'm actually going to run this survey on my newsletter as well, so we may get different results from the wider group of people who respond to this. But all of you looking at this list, you can ask yourself, are these the values that I would want to see represented in a statement of principles or guidance regarding artificial intelligence? What about consent? What about integrity? What about confidentiality? So anyhow, so I had a tie for the top. It's interesting. I wonder what the numbers were. The threshold. Anyhow, okay, that didn't go nearly as well as I would have liked, but Hey, you take your chances, you get your results. Have a look at the chat. I'm just going to see if anybody has commented on anything yet. We have Celeste's Otter Pilot to everyone. I'm an AI assistant helping Celeste Bird take notes for this meeting. Hey, that's great. That's really cool. And you notice that follows the principle of transparency, right? She's telling everybody, I'm an AI using this. Similarly, I'm an AI assistant helping Alex Cron take notes. And that's mostly what we've got for the chat. So that's really interesting. It's kind of funny. We can sort of project to a future where somebody like me does a presentation like this, except, of course, I'm very busy, and so I don't have time to do it in person. So I use an AI to look at all of my notes on the subject, compose a presentation, and then generate an animated image of me giving the talk. And then all of you, who are also very busy people, don't have time to actually attend this presentation. You all use your AI assistant to summarize the presentation that my AI just gave. We could have a completely automated presentation with no humans at all, either giving or listening to the presentation. It's a kind of a funny concept. All right. Treasury Board Canada, or Treasury Board Secretariat of Canada, recently authored a directive on automated decision making. This didn't really directly affect me, although I work for the public service. I work with the National Research Council of Canada, but they don't let me make decisions. But it did want to issue this directive, and it was kind of precautionary. I'm pretty sure there's not a lot of people. Oh, okay. Cindy says, I saw some of my answers, but not all. I think it said it was showing the first place votes. Oh, okay. Well, let's wonder if there's another way of showing that then. I don't know. Well, I'll share this link with you after, but now I'm puzzled by whether I can. The rounds data table. Yeah, so that's the first place votes. Huh. Oh, isn't this interesting? Round slider. Okay, I see. Well, I don't know. Well, anyhow, these are the first place votes. Sorry about that. Well, I got 4 responses then. Those were the 4 first place votes. I know I got 4 responses because it said that later on. And each of the 4 people voted for something different. I don't know why it's not showing the second place votes. Round, that's, oh, I see. Let's try this. Your first place vote isn't appearing. Okay. Well, how disappointing. I thought this would be a lot better than this. Maybe we'll get better results after we do the other elections on the ballot. See, there's the chart legend. Okay. I think what it's doing, I think it's trying to do it like one of those political conventions where you have a round, then you drop the bottom thing off the ballot, and then you have another round and you drop the bottom. That's not what I wanted. I just wanted to see the first place, second place, and third place, etc. And I thought I would see that. That's what it looked like in the demo. Anyhow, so yeah. I'll still keep collecting this data and I'll try to put better versions of it on the slide. Anyhow, back to the Treasury Board Secretariat. So they required, and this is very process based, which is typical for a government. So it's almost like virtue based, but for an organization, which is kind of interesting. We don't really think about whether an organization can have AI ethics, but of course it can, right? If you have institutional policies, you as an organization are probably more ethical than an organization that does not have institutional policies. Maybe. Anyhow, so this is for the organization, and it recommends doing an impact assessment, which is very consequentialist, right? Transparency, what we've talked about, quality assurance, which we haven't really talked about, but what counts as quality? Well, they list it. Testing, making sure we have quality data, making sure we have proper data governance processes so that we eliminate duplicates and make sure our data isn't too old and make sure our data coverage is complete. Peer review, gender-based analysis plus. I think that plus might also mean, and this is TBS jargon here, but I believe that means, it's not just analysis based on male or female, but also non-binary and other genders. Employee training, IT and business continuity, security, legal, and ensuring human intervention. So, but what I don't see, maybe it's contained under data quality, is representation from different cultural groups. I don't see that in there. And that obviously, if we're doing gender-based analysis, why aren't we doing culture-based analysis or nation-based analysis? I think that's important. And then finally, recourse and reporting. So this directive is in force now, and it does govern public sector workers like me, although I don't make decisions with or without AI. Amnesty International, by contrast, takes an approach based on equality and non-discrimination. And if we had to trace that back, it probably goes back to responsibility and duty and the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And they approach this in a few different ways. One is using the framework of international human rights law. And so that establishes basic rights. And again, that's based on the idea that all humans have intrinsic or inherent value, right? How do you express that value? Through a statement of rights. So each human being, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, have certain rights. And here, as an example, the rights to equality or equity, depends on how you want to phrase this, right? And non-discrimination. And then actively preventing discrimination. And then on the more positive side, promoting diversity and inclusion. And they also explicitly assign duties to nations, duties to promote human rights, first of all, by identifying risks to human rights, ensuring transparency and accountability so that we can know whether or not human rights violations occurred, and then finally enforcing oversight, making sure that there is an agency that watches and ensures that government departments respect human rights. So you can see how this would apply to AI. Basically, this guideline would say that there should be an AI governing body of some sort in a nation. And this AI should ensure that proper processes are followed, similar to the Treasury Board Secretariat guidelines, but also should be monitoring for consequences, and in particular, consequences related to the violation of human rights. So, this is backwards. Oh, okay. So, our next quiz. Who are we responsible to? We've talked about duties and obligations, but to whom do we have these duties and obligations? That's the second election. And even though our results don't come out great, I'd still ask you to put in your response. And there's a lot of different groups that we can be responsible to. The less fortunate, perhaps, to our clients, if we're a professional like a lawyer or a doctor or a social worker. To children, do they have special rights? Arguably, they do. Others are writing, I spelled it wrong, sorry about that. Responsible to the law. How about responsibility to ourselves? Put your own oxygen on mask first, sort of thing. Shareholders, funders, unions, professions, students, all of these would be typical in an educational context. Students, society, environment, country, a wider perspective. Research subjects, if we're a researcher, we may well have responsibility specifically to whomever we're researching about. Parents or guardians, this applies especially to children. We're responsible not only to the children, but to the people who are responsible for the children, and maybe to our employer and to our colleagues. Now, I'm ranking these because often these obligations conflict. Your responsibility to a child might conflict with your responsibility to a funder. A funder might want to collect children's data to market fast food to them. But your responsibility to the child might come in conflict with that, based on the idea that the child has, the rights of privacy, confidentiality, and to not be advertised to by fast food companies. But anyhow, fill in your selections here, and we'll see what the results look like in just a little bit. So I've looked at amnesty, and I've looked at TBC. Let's come back to Canada. The government of Canada recently, this year, issued a guide on the use of generative artificial intelligence. And as we talked about earlier, generative AI is the new type of AI that writes text, creates images, etc. And the government principles follow what's called the FASTER principle, which is an interesting acronym, saying that these uses should be fair, and they describe what they believe fair is, accountable, secure, transparent, educated, and many principles don't include a responsibility of the users to be educated about the strengths, limitations, and responsible use of AI tools. And then finally, relevant. using AI only where it's appropriate to use AI. The OECD also has principles, and these are intended to apply worldwide, especially to economically developed countries, in their view, but also, because it's OECD, to all countries. They're more outcomes centered, and they have a specific set of outcomes that they favor. Things like inclusive growth, sustainable development, and well-being. And sustainable development is interesting because there are some sets of principles that explicitly link the use of AI to the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, or SDGs, which are some 24 different goals. For example, protecting the environment, promoting the rights of women, promoting the rights of children, ensuring everybody has an adequate education, things like that. And these are specifically linked to the development of AI. Creating a profit for shareholders, not one of the sustainable development goals, which is interesting. So growth, as OECD defines it, is not necessarily sustainable development as UNESCO defines it. OECD also favors human-centered values and fairness. It's interesting that it links those together. Transparency and explainability, which we talked about. Robustness, whatever that means. Security and safety. So they are risk averse, similar to many governments. And then finally, accountability. And that goes back to the question of duty. So let's look at the results of that second survey. And, oh, interesting. The top choices here were children, funder, society, and environment. And I don't think we could get 4 different priorities if we tried. And it really raises the question, this is why I wanted to see in the display second place, third place, fourth place votes, is, if we had to choose between them, how do we choose? And I gave already the example of children versus funder, which seems pretty clear cut. But what if promoting the interests of children is in a certain way bad for the environment? Now we have a tougher question to ask, and really we have to ask about the details of it. Interesting. The University of Helsinki has provided an AI ethics MOOC. I think it'd be useful to look at for people. They basically provide 5 principles of AI ethics, answering 5 different questions. We focused on just one. But here they sort of break down into the different ethical theories. Should we use AI for good and not for causing harm? Well, I think probably, right? Who should be blamed when AI causes harm? And by blamed, we talk about held accountable, but even more to the point, if there's a cost or retribution necessary, who should pay, or restoration necessary? Should we understand what and why AI does whatever it does? I think that would be a huge challenge. I mean, it's hard for AI experts to say why an AI does something it does. Very hard, not a simple question. Should AI be fair, or I would say, and non-discriminative, the principle of fairness? Again, we're probably going to say yes, but is that the most important principle? OECD might say no, because productivity in their minds might be more important. Should AI respect and promote human rights? Those are 2 different things, obviously. We would hope it respects human rights, But does AI have a responsibility to promote human rights? Different question. Finally, what matters? Now let's go to the third question. So again, enter your votes for the third question on the ballot. So we'll go to the next election. Foundational principles. On what are our ethics of artificial intelligence based? And these, again, these are principles that came up in the different documents that we've looked at, both the ones I've talked about in this session and the ones I reviewed in my study. Everything from professional requirement, fact, universality, that's the Kantian principle again, defensibility, or can we rationalize it after the fact, fundamental rights, balance, or trade-offs, finding the middle ground, trust. Haven't talked about trust yet. Should it be based on what we know? Should it be based on social good or maybe social order? Or should it be based on fairness? And again, which of these we choose may conflict with other of these foundational values in a particular circumstance. So I'll have you put those in. We're almost done our session. So this is the University of Helsinki AI Ethics MOOC. So there's another resource just came out recently. Brian Alexander, who's a friend and colleague of mine, asked a question on his blog, what readings would be best for people in a postgraduate class. So I guess fairly high level readings, and he got a lot of good answers. Here are the things that he listed in his course, but then in the comments, this is where you get really good responses. And you know, I've read quite a number of these, and some of these are well worth reading. You want to have a look at this conversation. It's a YouTube episode with Mark Andreessen, who's a venture capitalist, on the future of AI. As it says here, this might be useful as an example of venture capital hubris. And there's many, many more. Now, let me check the chat. I have to find the chat. Chat. Oh, I can't find the chat. Oh, here we go. And last minute items before the meeting ends. Oh, this is their oh, this is interesting. Oh, I want to read these later. These are the actual comments. All right, so let's have a last look at the results from our survey. Here we go. So let's move on to the next one. Oh, this is better. Okay, so this is showing me all my results now. This is what I thought I would get the first time. So here are some of the other second and third place votes for the first set. Yeah. Okay, I wonder if I get different results for, okay, oh, this is for the third one. Okay, so social good, fundamental rights, facts, and trust were the top four chosen, with second and third place votes going to fairness, balance of risks, what we know, etc. interesting. Professional requirements and defensibility didn't get a vote. Well, let's just reload this screen and see if we get our. No, it still doesn't show a second or third on those. I wonder why it showed them only on the one. That's very. Anyhow, I expected this for all of them. I don't know why I didn't get it. No, it's just going to show those. Oh well. Anyhow, I think that's really interesting. I think we've seen an example in this session of how just 4 people can have 4 very different outcomes. You know, for all 3 of the questions that I posed. So anyhow, that's basically the session. I thank you for your time and for your attention. You can find me at this website. And I'll hang on to see if there's any questions or comments. But if you need to go do something else right now,